So, what was all that about? The Tantivy was a horse-drawn coach that ran between Derby and Matlock Bath in the Derwent Valley of Derbyshire in the 1890s and returned there in 2017. The story of the Tantivy goes back a long way. Less than 300 years ago, much of Derbyshire was relatively inaccessible. The only transport across the heights was by pack-horse train. The ancient routes were deeply rutted tracks. The only public transport between London and Derby was by means of wagon. In 1733, George Pascal's wagon was taking 5 to 6 days to undertake the journey, with overnight stays. In 1742, the Derby flying wagon had cut this to a mere 4 days, but it was still not much quicker than walking. There were just a few roads along the edge of the Derwent Valley that were suitable for coaches. These old roads were well worn and in bad condition. But further north, and in the valley itself, the rutted routes were totally unsuitable. Part of the problem was the system used since Tudor times to maintain the roads. Every year local people had to get together to work on their parish roads. The results were very unsatisfactory due to indifference, and also very unfair on parishes that had major routes running through them. So, starting with part of the Great North Road in 1665, trusts were set up who could charge tolls in order to maintain the roads properly. Initially they just maintained roads, but later they made improvements, created diversions, and eventually built totally new, well-engineered routes. Turnpike trusts developed a system of toll houses and toll gates to collect the money, and set up mileposts to inform the travellers. Turnpike roads developed slowly in the Derwent Valley, but eventually formed the network that is still the road system that the area uses today. New roads meant faster timings for coaches, and by 1764 a flying machine on steel springs was performing the London to Derby journey in just 1 day. In the 17th century, private carriages had begun to replace wagons to provide faster coach services. But as this Hogarth print shows, they were originally far from ideal. Outside passengers had the choice of either balancing on the traditional domed roof or being jostled in with luggage in the rear boot. Later, the more familiar coaches with outside seating made life for these passengers a bit more comfortable. The turnpike trusts were using new technology. Telford was creating very firm road bases using layers of varying stone sizes. The macadam system was more popular because it was able to use recycled road-making material. These firmer roads were providing the faster times. Faster timings meant no more overnight stops or even meal breaks. Passengers only had a few minutes for personal needs, including hasty food and meal breaks, at coaching inns while the horses were changed. The incentive to improve the road network of the Derwent Valley was the result of two main developments. One was the sudden realization in the early 18th century of the value of the natural beauty of places such as Matlock Bath. The other was the sudden explosion of the manufacture of cotton thread using water power that started here in Cromford in 1771 in a mill built next to an old pack-horse bridge. In fact, Richard Arkwright built the Greyhound Hotel in Cromford Village, which later became a coaching inn. Ironically, the turnpike road along the valley was one of the last to be built. The ancient route between Belper and Cromford involved steep climbs at each end. The great landowners of the valley had linked up their estate drives and lanes in order to form a private road along the valley that only they could use. Finally, in 1818, the Cromford and Belper Turnpike Road was opened with toll gates at Amber Gate and Mere Brook, and a branch road to Bull Bridge. It was paid for by local landowners and industrialists who contributed according to their wealth and interest. The toll house, called the Amber Gate, was in the middle of the road junction, with gates on 3 sides. In 1784, John Palmer, a theatre proprietor in Bath, suggested to the government the idea of a network of stagecoach services dedicated to transporting the Royal Mail. These coaches would carry only a few passengers and always have a well-armed guard on board. The routes all radiated from London. Palmer was allowed to develop cross-mails between other cities and became very rich as a result. Every night at 8 o'clock, 27 mail coaches left the General Post Office in London at the same time to travel overnight to the far corners of the kingdom. It must have been an amazing sight. Inspired by the performance of mail coaches, the ordinary stagecoaches improved their service. But sadly, it was not until the railways began to compete that they reached their peak stage of development. In 1835, Derby was full of coaching inns. The newer ones replaced earlier ones that had been established for a long time. There were 9 coaches that provided services along the Derwent Valley north of Derby, most providing a daily run in each direction. The newspapers of the time provided advertisements with timetables and fares and woodcut illustrations that were probably totally unlike the actual coaches used. The Derby and Manchester mail coach was provided by Wallace, a substantial Derby-based coach proprietor. London to Manchester stage services via Derby and Matlock were provided by the competing Peveril of the Peak and the Royal Bruce coaches. The Royal Bruce was so named because it used to run into Scotland. The Lord Nelson and the Lady Nelson provided services between Nottingham and Manchester via Derby and Matlock. The Star ran from Derby to Sheffield via Matlock. It was one of a new type of service, provided for well-heeled visitors. It was advertised as being attractive to the sportsmen, particularly the fishermen, and to parties of pleasure. Coaching inns were established along the new turnpike in Belper. The George and the Red Lion have survived and still retain the arches into the coaching yard and the frontages of the booking offices. But it was all to end suddenly. When the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1829, the world's first intercity railway, the Royal Mail immediately transferred to using the new trains. Coaches quickly became redundant, coachmen lost their jobs, and the horses were sold off. The golden era of coaching was over. Coaches survived on routes that railways did not reach. There was no railway between Derby and Matlock until 1849. On the day that the railway opened, the first train overtook the Derby Derby to Manchester stagecoach between Ambergate and Wat Stanwell. The coach driver, William Lyons, made a futile attempt to race the train, shouting, "Dang ye broken-winded devils, we'll thrash ye off the road yet." But as the train passed on effortlessly, he sank back into his seat and said, "Well, they've gotten a piece of my mind, anyhow, like it or lump it." The Derby Dilly made its last run in 1855, but as the railway timetable shows, there was still a role for horse transport, providing connecting omnibuses to Chatsworth, Haddon and Bakewell. There was also a role in linking the new railway stations to the towns that they served. For example, this is the horse bus that links the Lion Hotel in Belper to the railway station, which at that time was located south of the town. Stagecoaches continued to have a role serving the places that railways did not reach. The very last one ran between Minehead and Linton, using the very steep Porlock Hill until 1920. As they faded away, the glamour of coaching began to be missed. The last stagecoach between London and Brighton, the Old Times, ran in 1862. But it was taken over by a group of gentlemen enthusiasts, a bit like heritage railway trains today, and they continued to run it. This was the start of the so-called road coach revival. Wealthy people would sponsor the operation of a coach that would take a leisurely day trip route. The costs would be offset by people paying to travel on it or paying to send parcels. The most expensive seat was now the one next to the driver, because that passenger would be able to have a go and take over the reins. Unlike the earlier coaching operations, this revival took place in the era of photography. By 1873, revival coaches were operating on 11 routes radiating from London. Eventually they operated further afield as well. The first one in Derbyshire was the Champion, which began running in 1884 between Matlock and Buxton. It was not always very profitable. On one rainy day in July, it carried just one parcel between Buxton and Matlock Bath, and no passengers, on a trip which had 4 changes of horses, 24 horses in all. The 1895 road coach guide showed that by then there were 18 services radiating from London. 8 elsewhere in England, 3 in Scotland, 2 in Ireland, 2 in France, and 4 in the USA. One of these was the Tantivy. Tom Miller was the son of Harriet Miller, a widow who was the proprietor of the Stanhope Arms near Burton-on-Trent railway station. They also ran livery stables and a hansom cab taxi service from nearby premises on Wellington Street. In 1891 he operated a revival coach service between Tamworth and Lichfield on behalf of a Mr. Cozier. The coach used was called the Telephone. 2 years later a new proprietor took over, John Eadie, the son of a Burton brewery owner. He sponsored the operation of the coach between Burton and Tamworth. It was now called Tantivy, a more traditional name. In 1894 and 1895, Eadie was sponsoring a service between the St James's Hotel in Derby and the New Bath Hotel in Matlock Bath using Tantivy. It left Derby at 11 a.m, changed horses at the Lion Hotel in Belper, and arrived for lunch at the New Bath Hotel at 1 p.m, returning from there at 5 o'clock. Tom Miller was still operating it. The following year Eadie was running using a new coach specially built for him called the Defiance between Derby and Matlock Bath. He enlisted Harry King, a well-known coach driver, to drive it. At the end of the season the horses which had been used were all sold off, and that was the end of coaching on this route. In 1897 Eadie married Mabel Leach, the daughter of a Derby alderman, who lived at Oaklands on Duffield Road in Derby. It would be nice to think that she had spotted her future husband as he drove past on his coach. In later life he lived at Barrow Hall. Poor old Tom Miller died in 1899 when he got drunk and fell from the top of a hansom cab onto his head. We do not know what happened to the Tantivy, but maybe it was stored in the yard at the back of the premises on Wellington Street. The last revival coach service operated in 1939 by Mr. Priestman, using distinctive grey horses and bright red livery. In 1931 he had operated the last service in Derbyshire between Matlock and Buxton. Tantivy next appears in Hinckley, where it was repainted in the disguise of a stagecoach operating between London and Chester via the town. It was used in the parade to celebrate the Silver Jubilee of 1935 and afterwards presented to the local museum. Hinckley is known as the birthplace of the inventor of the hansom cab. In 2015, Adrian Lander, a Forest of Dean businessman, had taken on the restoration of the hansom cab preserved in Hinckley Museum, and as part of the deal also took on the ownership and restoration of Tantivy. It was at this time that Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site volunteers planned to do something to celebrate 200 years of the Cromford to Belper Turnpike Road. Kevin Morrell of Belper found out that the Tantivy, which had operated along that road in the 1890s, still existed, and so the idea of bringing the coach back to Derbyshire during Discovery Days developed. Adrian Lander had restored Tantivy in yet another disguise as the Comet that had operated between Ross-on-Wye and Hereford, but he duly converted it back. During restoration, the original maker's plate became evident. The coach had been built by Collard and Selby, a well-known builder, during the revival period, but the chassis was much older, probably recycled from a redundant mail coach. The one-day operation was organised by a small committee of volunteers. Seats were sold for the journey in both directions, 24 in total. The Tantivy left from the rear of the Lion Hotel in Belper, flagged away by the town mayor and supported by costumed reenactors. All the seats were sold, with passengers coming from as far away as the USA and Russia. At the last minute, Adrian Lander's lead horse went lame, so he quickly substituted the TriStar team, probably the best four-in-hand team in the country. The coach did a loop in Belper so that it could pass in front of the Lion Hotel. It continued along the A6 to Cromford, following the 200-year-old Turnpike Road. At Cromford there was a break for lunch at the Greyhound Hotel, a change of passengers and a rest and meal break for the horses. Tantivy then returned to Belper, pausing to allow traffic to overtake at the old toll house on Wattstamwell Bridge, which is now the Family Tree Restaurant. Hundreds of people watched Tantivy return. It was a truly magical and historic day.